The amber light caught the unusual flecks of gold in Elena Vasquez's green eyes as she stepped off the Greyhound bus in Cedar Falls, Montana, clutching a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her, the bus driver avoided making eye contact, just as every passenger had during the 18-hour journey from Phoenix. She had grown accustomed to the stares and whispered comments about her distinctive gaze, the vertical pupils that dilated in dim light and seemed to glow with an inner fire. That made people uncomfortable. At 26, Elena had learned that her unusual eyes were both a curse and a peculiar gift that set her apart from everyone she had ever known. The marriage broker in Phoenix had been blunt about the challenges her appearance would create. Men looking for traditional mail-order brides wanted conventional beauty, not the unsettling intensity of eyes that seemed to see too much and reflect light like polished stone. But Robert Mitchell, a rancher from Cedar Falls, had claimed that her eyes were exactly what he was seeking in a wife. His letters had been filled with romantic descriptions of mountain sunsets and promises of a life where her unique appearance would be appreciated rather than feared. The correspondence had continued for 6 months, with Robert sending photographs of his sprawling ranch property and detailed descriptions of the isolated mountain community where they would build their life together. Elena had saved every dollar from her job cleaning hotel rooms in Phoenix to afford the bus ticket to Montana. The marriage broker had collected her fee in advance, promising that Robert Mitchell was a successful cattle rancher who needed a strong woman to help manage his remote property. The arrangement seemed perfect for someone who had spent her entire life feeling like an outsider in conventional society. The bus station in Cedar Falls was little more than a wooden bench outside Peterson's general store, and Elena could see the entire downtown area from where she stood on the cracked sidewalk. 3 blocks of weathered storefronts, a single traffic light, and perhaps 200 residents who seemed to emerge from doorways and windows to stare at the stranger with the unsettling eyes. Elena checked the address Robert had provided in his final letter. But as she walked through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, she began to notice details that didn't match his descriptions of a thriving mountain community. Half the businesses appeared to be permanently closed, with faded signs and dusty windows that suggested years of abandonment. The few people she encountered on the sidewalks looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The address led her to a rundown boarding house on the edge of town, not the prosperous ranch property she had been expecting. The building's paint was peeling, the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated snow, and several windows were covered with plastic sheeting instead of glass. Elena climbed the creaking steps and knocked on the front door, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in trusting Robert's promises. The woman who answered the door was Margaret Flynn, the boarding house owner, a heavy-set woman in her 60s with suspicious eyes and an unwelcoming expression. Margaret looked Elena up and down with obvious disapproval, paying particular attention to her distinctive gaze. "You must be the mail-order bride Robert was expecting," Margaret said, without any warmth in her voice. "He left town 3 days ago. Said he changed his mind about getting married and wouldn't be coming back." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She had spent her life savings on the journey to Montana, and she had no way to return to Phoenix even if she wanted to. More devastating than the financial loss was the emotional impact of another rejection based on her appearance. Robert had seen her photographs before proposing marriage, but apparently the reality of her unusual eyes had been too unsettling for him to accept. "Did he leave any message for me?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the crushing disappointment. "Just said to tell you that the arrangement was off and that you should find your own way back to wherever you came from," Margaret replied. "He paid for 1 night's lodging, but after that, you're on your own." Elena spent that night in a small cold room on the boarding house's second floor, staring out the window at the snow-covered mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls. The peaks rose like ancient guardians around the valley, their surfaces gleaming silver in the moonlight. Despite her desperate circumstances, she felt drawn to the wilderness beyond the town, as if something in those mountains was calling to her. The next morning brought new complications when Elena discovered that Robert Mitchell had not only abandoned their marriage arrangement, but had also spread rumors about her throughout the small community. According to Margaret, he had told several local men that Elena was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous, warning them to avoid any contact with her. The few job opportunities in Cedar Falls quickly disappeared as word spread about Robert's warnings. The general store wouldn't hire her, the diner refused her application, and even the church declined her request for temporary shelter. Elena realized that she was trapped in a community that viewed her as both an outsider and a threat, with no resources and no allies. By the third day, Elena had spent her last dollar on a meager breakfast at the boarding house, and Margaret informed her that she would have to vacate the room by evening. As she walked through the empty streets of Cedar Falls, Elena felt the weight of complete isolation settling on her shoulders. She had never felt more alone or hopeless in her entire life. The breakthrough came when she encountered Thomas Wright, a rugged man in his 40s who made his living as a mountain lion tracker and wilderness guide. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas had been hired by the state wildlife department to monitor predator populations in the remote areas surrounding Cedar Falls, and he spent most of his time alone in the mountains with only his tracking dogs for company. Elena first saw Thomas outside Peterson's general store, loading supplies into a battered pickup truck that looked like it had been modified for serious off-road travel. What struck her immediately was that when their eyes met, Thomas didn't look away or show the usual signs of discomfort that her gaze typically produced in strangers. Instead, he studied her face with the kind of professional interest that a tracker might show when examining unusual animal signs. "You're the woman Robert Mitchell was supposed to marry," Thomas said, approaching her with confident, measured steps. "I heard he left town rather suddenly." "News travels fast in a small community," Elena replied, unsure whether Thomas was planning to warn her away like everyone else had done. "Robert's always been a coward when it comes to anything he doesn't understand," Thomas continued. "The question is whether you're planning to let his narrow-mindedness define your future, or if you're interested in discovering what brought you to this particular place at this particular time." The comment surprised Elena because it suggested that Thomas might see her situation differently than the rest of the community had. "What do you mean?" Thomas gestured toward the mountains that surrounded the valley. "This area has a long history of unusual occurrences and unexplained phenomena. People with distinctive abilities often find themselves drawn here, sometimes for reasons they don't initially understand. Your eyes suggest that you might be one of those people." "My eyes are just a genetic abnormality," Elena said defensively. "They don't mean anything special." "Maybe," Thomas replied. "Or maybe they're exactly what this community has been waiting for without realizing it. Have you ever spent time in wilderness areas? Ever notice that animals react to you differently than they do to other people?" The question caught Elena off guard because it touched on something she had always tried to ignore. Throughout her life, she had noticed that cats, dogs, and wild animals seemed unusually comfortable around her, as if they recognized something familiar in her presence. Stray cats would approach her fearlessly, birds would land nearby without showing normal caution, and even aggressive dogs would calm down when she looked directly at them. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean anything supernatural. Some people just have a way with animals." Thomas smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Elena had encountered since arriving in Cedar Falls. "Would you be interested in earning some honest work while you figure out your next steps. I need an assistant for a tracking expedition in the northern mountains. The pay isn't much, but it includes food, shelter, and the chance to see country that most people never experience. The offer represented Elena's only viable option for survival, but it also appealed to something deeper than mere practical necessity. The mountains had been calling to her since her first night in Cedar Falls, and the prospect of exploring the wilderness with someone who didn't seem afraid of her unusual appearance was surprisingly attractive. "What kind of tracking expedition?" she asked. "There have been reports of unusual mountain lion activity in the remote areas north of here," Thomas explained. "Large cats that don't behave like normal predators, sightings in areas where mountain lions haven't been seen for decades, and livestock kills that don't match typical hunting patterns. The state wants me to investigate and determine if there's a problem with the local population." Elena felt a strange excitement building in her chest as Thomas described the expedition. The idea of tracking large predators through mountain wilderness seemed to resonate with something fundamental in her nature, as if she was finally being offered the chance to do work that matched her capabilities. "When would we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," Thomas replied. "The weather forecast shows a clear window for the next week, and I want to reach the high country before the next storm system moves through." That evening, Elena used the last of her money to purchase basic camping supplies from Peterson's General Store. The proprietor, an elderly man named Harold Peterson, seemed surprised by her selections. "You planning to spend time in the backcountry?" Harold asked as he rang up her purchases of thermal undergarments, hiking boots, and cold weather gear. "I'm going to assist Thomas Wright with a wildlife tracking expedition," Elena explained. Harold's expression became more serious. "Thomas is one of the best trackers in the state, but those northern mountains can be dangerous for people who don't understand the country. There are stories about that area, old stories that most folks prefer not to discuss." "What kind of stories?" Harold glanced around the empty store as if making sure they wouldn't be overheard. "Stories about animals that are more than animals. Places where the normal rules don't apply, and people who go into those mountains and come back changed. Native tribes used to consider that country sacred, and they had good reasons for their beliefs." The warning should have made Elena reconsider her decision to join Thomas's expedition, but instead it only intensified her anticipation. She had spent her entire life feeling like she didn't belong in conventional society, and the prospect of entering a place where normal rules didn't apply seemed like an opportunity rather than a threat. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountain peaks appear closer than they actually were. Thomas arrived at the boarding house driving a modified pickup truck equipped with heavy-duty tires, extra fuel tanks, and storage compartments for expedition supplies. His 2 tracking dogs, a German shepherd named Rex and a mixed breed called Scout, waited patiently in the truck bed, their breath visible in the frigid air. "Ready for adventure?" Thomas asked as Elena loaded her gear into the truck. "Ready," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to undertake. As they drove out of Cedar Falls toward the northern mountains, Thomas explained more about the unusual predator activity that had prompted the state's investigation. Ranchers in remote areas had been reporting livestock kills that showed patterns unlike anything in the historical record. The attacks were too frequent to be natural hunting behavior, too organized to be random predation, and too selective to be the work of desperate or diseased animals. "Most concerning are the eyewitness accounts," Thomas continued as they navigated a winding mountain road that seemed to climb endlessly toward the peaks. "People are describing mountain lions that are larger than any known subspecies, with unusual coloration and behavior patterns that don't match anything in the wildlife management literature." "How much larger?" Elena asked. "Reports range from animals the size of small tigers to cats that appear to be nearly as large as adult bears. The descriptions are probably exaggerated by fear and poor lighting conditions, But even allowing for that, we're looking at predators that are significantly outside the normal size range. The road eventually deteriorated into a rough track. That required four-wheel drive and careful navigation around fallen rocks and washouts. Thomas drove with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route many times, but Elena could see that they were moving into country that was genuinely remote and potentially dangerous. After 4 hours of steady climbing, they reached Thomas's base camp, a collection of weathered buildings nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. The main structure was a log cabin that had been built decades earlier, probably by miners or loggers who had worked the area during its more prosperous periods. Additional buildings included a storage shed, a workshop, and what appeared to be kennels for Thomas's tracking dogs. "This is home during expedition season," Thomas explained as they unloaded their supplies. "The cabin has basic amenities, wood heat, propane for cooking, and a generator for essential electricity. No phone service, no internet, and no neighbors. For at least 20 miles in any direction." Elena found the isolation appealing rather than intimidating. For the first time since leaving Phoenix, she felt like she was in a place where her unusual appearance and antisocial tendencies might be advantages rather than obstacles. As they settled into the cabin, Thomas began explaining the techniques they would use to track the unusual mountain lions. Traditional tracking methods combined with modern technology, including trail cameras, GPS units, and communication equipment that would allow them to maintain contact with state wildlife officials. "The most important thing to understand about tracking large predators," Thomas said as they examined topographical maps of the surrounding area, "is that you're entering their world, not inviting them into yours. Success requires thinking like a predator, understanding their motivations and behavior patterns, and respecting their capabilities." Elena studied the maps carefully, noting the remote valleys and ridge systems that would provide habitat for large cats. Something about the terrain felt familiar, as if she had explored these mountains in dreams or previous lives. The feeling was so strong that she found herself anticipating features of the landscape before Thomas pointed them out on the maps. "Have you ever been in this area before?" Thomas asked, noticing her apparent familiarity with the geography. "No," Elena replied honestly. "But it feels like I should know this place." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "That's not uncommon for people who have natural wilderness instincts. Some individuals have an intuitive understanding of mountain country that goes beyond learned experience." Their first expedition began before dawn the following morning. Thomas led Elena along a narrow trail that wound through dense forest toward a series of high meadows where the unusual predator activity had been most frequently reported. Tracking dogs ranged ahead of them, following scent trails that were invisible to human senses, but clearly defined for their enhanced abilities. Elena discovered that she had natural talent for wilderness travel. Her balance and coordination on difficult terrain impressed Thomas, and she seemed to anticipate changes in the trail surface or weather conditions before they became apparent. More significantly, her unusual eyes provided advantages in low-light conditions that allowed her to spot details that Thomas missed even with his years of experience. "You see things differently than most people," Thomas observed as they paused to examine what appeared to be large cat tracks in a muddy stream bank. "It's not just your eyes, though they're certainly part of it. You process visual information in ways that most humans can't match." The tracks they were following were indeed larger than any mountain lion prints in Thomas's reference materials. The paw pads measured nearly 5 inches across, suggesting an animal that would weigh over 200 pounds. More puzzling was the depth of the impressions, which indicated that the cat was significantly heavier than its track size would normally suggest. "These prints are fresh," Elena said, kneeling beside the clearest track. "Maybe 6 hours old, based on how the edges are holding their shape in the soil moisture." Thomas looked surprised by her assessment. "How do you know that?" "Aging tracks. is one of the most difficult aspects of wilderness tracking. Elena wasn't sure how to explain that she could somehow sense the passage of time in the animal's sign, as if the tracks retain some essence of the creature that had made them. "It just feels recent," she said finally. They followed the trail deeper into the mountains, climbing toward a series of rocky outcroppings that provided excellent vantage points for predators hunting the valley below. The terrain became increasingly challenging as they gained elevation, with loose rock and steep slopes that required careful navigation. As they climbed, Elena began to notice other unusual signs that Thomas seemed unable to detect. The forest around them felt alive with a kind of electric energy that made her skin tingle, and she could hear sounds that didn't match any wildlife she had previously encountered. Low-frequency vocalizations that seemed to carry messages between unseen animals, and the rustle of movement through underbrush that suggested creatures much larger than the deer and elk that typically inhabited the area. "Do you hear that?" Elena asked during one of their rest stops. Thomas listened carefully but shook his head. "Hear what?" "There are large animals moving parallel to our route," Elena explained. "They've been following us for the past hour, staying about 50 yards off the trail." Thomas checked his GPS unit and radio, making sure their location was being properly recorded. His tracking dogs were alert, but not showing signs of distress, which suggested that whatever Elena was detecting wasn't an immediate threat. "Can you tell how many animals?" he asked. Elena closed her eyes and focused on the sounds that seemed to be coming from multiple directions. "At least 3, possibly more. They're coordinating their movements, which isn't typical behavior for solitary predators like mountain lions." The observation proved to be accurate when they reached a high meadow that provided clear sight lines across the surrounding forest. Elena spotted movement in the tree line that Thomas couldn't see even with binoculars. Large, tawny shapes that appeared to be watching their progress with intelligent interest. "There," Elena pointed toward a cluster of pine trees about 200 yards away. "Behind the deadfall near the large boulder." Thomas adjusted his binoculars and studied the area carefully. "I don't see anything." But as Elena continued watching, one of the shapes moved into a patch of sunlight, revealing itself to be a mountain lion of extraordinary size and unusual coloration. The cat's coat was a rich golden color with silver highlights that seemed to shimmer in the mountain light, and its size was indeed comparable to a small tiger. "Now I see it," Thomas said quietly, his voice filled with amazement. "That's the largest mountain lion I've ever observed in the wild." The cat studied them for several minutes, its gaze meeting Elena's across the meadow with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. There was intelligence in the animal's eyes that went beyond normal predator awareness, as if it was evaluating her as a potential ally rather than prey or threat. "It's looking directly at you," Thomas observed. "That's unusual behavior for a mountain lion. They typically avoid eye contact with humans." Elena felt a connection forming with the magnificent predator, a sense of recognition that she couldn't explain rationally. The cat's gaze held hers with what seemed like deliberate communication, and she found herself understanding that this encounter was significant beyond mere wildlife observation. After several minutes, the mountain lion turned and disappeared into the forest with fluid grace that belied its massive size. But Elena could sense that it hadn't gone far, and that their paths would cross again before the expedition was complete. "Have you ever seen anything like that before?" Elena asked Thomas as they continued toward their planned campsite. "Never," Thomas admitted. The size, the coloration, the behavior, everything about that animal was outside normal parameters. If I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed the reports we've been receiving." As they made camp in a protected valley surrounded by towering peaks, Elena began to understand that her rejection by Robert Mitchell might have been the best thing that could have happened to her. Instead of being trapped in a conventional marriage with a man who feared her differences, She was discovering capabilities and connections that she had never known she possessed. The mountains seemed to amplify her unusual perceptions, and the presence of the extraordinary predators felt like an invitation to explore aspects of herself that had been suppressed by years of trying to fit into normal society. For the first time in her life, Elena began to suspect that her strange eyes were not a curse to be hidden, but a gift that connected her to something ancient and powerful that dwelt in the high country. That night, as she lay in her sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the mountain wilderness, Elena heard something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the natural world. From somewhere in the distance came a sound that was part mountain lion scream and part human voice, as if the great cats were trying to communicate in a language that combined animal and human elements. The sound was answered by similar calls from other directions, creating a conversation that seemed to echo off the mountain peaks and carry messages that Elena almost understood. She felt a deep certainty that these sounds were connected to her presence in the mountains, and that the expedition would reveal secrets about herself and the wilderness that would change her understanding of what was possible in the world. Thomas was already asleep, apparently undisturbed by the exotic vocalizations that surrounded their camp. Elena realized that her ability to hear and interpret these sounds was another aspect of her unusual nature, and that the mountains were welcoming her into a community that existed beyond human understanding. As she drifted off to sleep, Elena felt the presence of the massive mountain lion they had encountered earlier, as if the great cat was standing guard over their camp. The sensation was protective rather than threatening, and she understood that. Her journey into the northern mountains would reveal connections between herself and the predator community that dwelt in the high country. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought her to Cedar Falls was beginning to seem like destiny rather than coincidence, and Elena Vasquez was about to discover that some rejections were actually invitations to find where she truly belonged. The first 3 days in the northern mountains revealed that Elena possessed tracking abilities that defied conventional explanation. While Thomas relied on his years of experience and scientific equipment to follow the unusual mountain lion signs, Elena seemed to navigate the wilderness using instincts that went beyond normal human senses. She could identify animal trails that were invisible to Thomas even with his magnifying equipment. Her sense of direction remained accurate even in dense forest where GPS signals were unreliable, and she demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict where they would find the next set of tracks or signs of predator activity. On the morning of their 4th day, Elena woke before dawn with the absolute certainty that something significant was about to happen. The feeling was so strong that she dressed quickly and stepped outside the camp to scan the surrounding forest. The mountain air was crisp and still, but she could sense movement in the distant tree line that suggested large animals were approaching their location. "Thomas," she called softly, not wanting to wake him abruptly, but knowing that he needed to be alert for whatever was coming. Thomas emerged from his tent within seconds, his tracking instincts sharp enough to recognize urgency in Elena's voice. "What do you see?" "They're coming," Elena said, pointing toward a ridge that overlooked their camp. "At least 5 of them, moving together like a coordinated pack." Thomas grabbed his binoculars and studied the ridge carefully. Mountain lions were typically solitary hunters, and the idea of 5 large cats traveling together contradicted everything he knew about predator behavior. But as he watched, shapes began to emerge from the morning shadows, confirming Elena's observation. The mountain lions that appeared on the ridge were unlike anything in Thomas's professional experience. Each animal was enormous, easily twice the size of normal cats, with the golden and silver coloration that witnesses had described in their reports. More disturbing was their behavior, which showed clear signs of intelligence and organization that went beyond typical predator hunting patterns. The lead cat, a magnificent female with distinctive silver markings around her face, studied their camp with the kind of careful assessment that suggested she was evaluating potential threats and opportunities. Her gaze fixed on Elena with particular intensity, and Thomas noticed that Elena was staring back without showing any signs of fear or submission. "They're not hunting us," Elena said quietly. "They're trying to determine if we belong here." "How can you tell?" "Body language," Elena replied, though she wasn't entirely sure how she knew. "If they were planning to attack, their posture would be different. This is more like a formal inspection." The standoff continued for nearly 10 minutes, with the mountain lions maintaining their position on the ridge, while Elena and Thomas remained motionless beside their camp. Finally, the lead female made a sound that was part growl and part complex vocalization, as if she was attempting to communicate in a language that combined animal and human elements. To Thomas's amazement, Elena responded with a similar sound, creating what appeared to be an actual conversation between human and predator. The exchange lasted several minutes, with both Elena and the mountain lion producing vocalizations that seemed to carry specific meaning and emotional content. "What are you doing?" Thomas whispered, afraid that any sudden movement might trigger an attack. "I'm not entirely sure," Elena admitted, "but I think I'm telling her that we're here to learn not to hunt or threaten their territory." The conversation concluded when the lead female made what sounded like an approving growl, then turned and led her companions back into the forest. But instead of disappearing completely, the cats positioned themselves at various points around the valley, maintaining visual contact with the camp while keeping their distance. "They're going to escort us," Elena said, with growing confidence in her ability to interpret the predator's intentions. "We're being granted permission to explore their territory, but under supervision." Thomas spent the rest of the morning documenting what they had observed, taking photographs and recording GPS coordinates that would help state wildlife officials understand the scope of the unusual predator activity. But he was beginning to realize that conventional wildlife management techniques would be inadequate for dealing with animals that demonstrated such advanced intelligence and social organization. "These cats are operating on a level that's closer to wolves or dolphins than typical mountain lions," he told Elena as they prepared to continue their expedition. "The coordination, the communication patterns, the apparent decision-making process, all of it suggests cognitive abilities that shouldn't exist in solitary predators." Elena nodded, though privately she was beginning to suspect that the mountain lions were far more than unusual animals. The ease with which she had communicated with them suggested a connection that went beyond normal human and animal interaction. Her distinctive eyes seemed to be recognized by the predators as a sign of kinship or shared identity. As they hiked deeper into the mountains, following ancient game trails that led toward the highest peaks, Elena began experiencing flashes of memory or vision that seemed to come from sources outside her own experience. Images of the mountain valleys during different seasons, knowledge of hidden water sources and shelter locations, and an understanding of the mountain ecosystem that felt inherited rather than learned. The visions became more frequent and detailed as they gained elevation. Elena saw the mountains as they had existed centuries earlier, when indigenous peoples had considered the high country sacred and had maintained spiritual relationships with the predator communities that ruled the wilderness. She understood that the unusual mountain lions were guardians of something ancient and powerful that dwelt in the remote valleys, and that her presence in their territory was connected to responsibilities she was only beginning to comprehend. On their 6th day in the mountains, Thomas and Elena discovered evidence that transformed their wildlife tracking expedition into something far more significant. Hidden in a canyon that didn't appear on any of their topographical maps, they found the remains of a settlement that predated any known human habitation in the area. The structures were built from massive stone blocks that had been fitted together with precision that rivaled ancient Roman engineering. Despite obvious age, the buildings remained largely intact, protected by the canyon's natural shelter and the dry mountain climate. More intriguing were the carvings that covered every surface, depicting humans and large cats in what appeared to be collaborative hunting and ceremony. "This place isn't in any archaeological survey," Thomas said as they explored the settlements. Central Plaza. "If this site is as old as it appears, it could rewrite the history of human occupation in North America." Elena studied the carvings more carefully, finding that she could somehow interpret their meaning despite having no training in ancient languages or symbols. The images told the story of a people who had formed spiritual and practical partnerships with the mountain lion population, sharing the wilderness in a relationship that benefited both species. "They weren't just neighbors," Elena explained, as she traced one particularly detailed carving with her fingertip. "The humans and cats were allies. The people provided intelligence and tool use, while the cats provided hunting skills and territorial protection." "How do you know that?" Thomas asked, studying the same carving but seeing only abstract symbols. Elena wasn't sure how to explain that the meanings of the carvings were becoming clear to her, as if she was remembering rather than learning. "It just makes sense when you look at the patterns. See how the humans and cats are positioned in relation to each other in the hunting scenes. They're working together, not competing." Their exploration of the settlement was interrupted by the return of the mountain lion escort that had been following them through the mountains. But now the cats approached much closer, led by the same magnificent female who had studied them from the ridge several days earlier. The lead cat walked directly up to Elena and began what could only be described as a formal greeting, rubbing against her legs and producing complex vocalizations that sounded almost conversational. Elena responded instinctively, placing her hand on the cat's massive head and replying with sounds that seemed to come from deep in her throat. Thomas watched in fascination as Elena and the mountain lion conducted what was clearly a meaningful exchange. Other cats emerged from the canyon walls and approached the ancient plaza, creating a gathering that felt ceremonial in nature. "They're welcoming me," Elena told Thomas, though she was as surprised by the revelation as he was. "This place is sacred to them, and they're acknowledging that I belong here." The ceremony continued for over an hour, with each mountain lion approaching Elena individually and engaging in the same greeting ritual. By the end of the process, Elena felt fundamentally changed, as if something dormant in her nature had been awakened by contact with the predator community. "What happens now?" Thomas asked as the mountain lions began to disperse back into the surrounding forest. "Now we learn what they've been trying to protect," Elena replied, though she wasn't sure where that knowledge was coming from. The settlement contained numerous structures that served different purposes within the ancient community. The largest building appeared to be a ceremonial hall where humans and cats had gathered for shared rituals and decision-making. Smaller structures had been used for food storage, tool-making, and what appeared to be medical or healing practices that combined human knowledge with natural remedies derived from mountain plants. But the most significant discovery was a series of underground chambers that had been carved directly into the canyon's bedrock. These chambers contained artifacts and records that documented the Kiko relationship between the human and predator communities over thousands of years. Elena found that she could read the ancient script as easily as if it had been written in modern English. The records described a time when certain humans possessed abilities that allowed them to communicate with predator species and serve as intermediaries between the animal and human worlds. These individuals, known as bridge walkers, were characterized by distinctive physical features that marked them as being connected to both human and predator nature. The most common identifying trait was unusual eyes that reflected light and dilated in patterns similar to large cat pupils. "Bridge walkers," Elena read from one of the stone tablets. "Those who walk between the world of humans and the world of hunters. They serve as guardians of the sacred places where both species find strength and wisdom." Thomas documented everything they discovered, but he was beginning to understand that their expedition had evolved beyond simple wildlife tracking. They had stumbled upon evidence of a lost civilization that had achieved a level of cooperation between humans and predators that modern science considered impossible. More significantly, Elena's ability to interpret the ancient records and communicate with the modern mountain lion population suggested that the bridge walker tradition was not extinct, but had been dormant, waiting for someone with the right genetic and spiritual characteristics to revive it. As they spent more time in the ancient settlement, Elena's connection to the mountain lion community deepened. The cats began bringing her information about threats to their territory, including evidence of illegal activities that were taking place in the remote valleys beyond the settled areas. The predators had been observing human encroachment into their sacred lands for years, watching as mining operations, illegal logging, and drug cultivation damaged the wilderness ecosystem. But they had no way to communicate their concerns to human authorities until Elena arrived with the ability to serve as a translator between species. "There's a mining operation about 15 miles north of here," Elena told Thomas after receiving information from the mountain lion scouts. "They're using explosives and heavy machinery in areas that are supposed to be protected wilderness. The cats say the chemicals from their processing are poisoning the water sources." Thomas checked his maps and confirmed that the area Elena described was indeed designated as protected federal wilderness where mining activities would be strictly illegal. "How are they getting away with operating in protected territory?" "Corruption," Elena replied, the word carrying memories from the ancient records she had been studying. "The same kind of corruption that has always threatened sacred places. People in authority positions being paid to ignore illegal activities." The revelation connected their mountain expedition to the larger patterns of corruption and environmental destruction that were occurring throughout the region. The unusual mountain lion activity that had prompted their investigation was actually the predator community's response to threats against their ancient territory. Thomas contacted state wildlife officials using his satellite communication equipment, but the response he received was disappointing and suspicious. Instead of immediate action to investigate the illegal mining operation, officials told him to complete his predator survey and return to town for debriefing. "They're not taking this seriously," Thomas told Elena after completing his radio conversation. "Either they don't believe our reports about the mining operation, or someone is preventing them from taking action." Elena felt the familiar chill of recognition that she had experienced when learning about corruption in her previous life. The pattern was the same whether the criminals were stealing federal development funds or destroying protected wilderness areas. Illegal profits protected by corrupt officials who were paid to prevent law enforcement intervention. "The cats want us to see the mining operation for ourselves," Elena said, interpreting communications she was receiving from the Mountain Lion Network. "They think visual evidence will be more convincing than second-hand reports." The journey to the illegal mining site required 2 days of travel through some of the most challenging mountain terrain Thomas had ever attempted to navigate. Elena proved to be an exceptional wilderness traveler, moving through the high country with a natural grace that impressed even Thomas's experienced tracking dogs. More significantly, the mountain lion escorts that accompanied them seemed to recognize Elena as their leader rather than their guest. The great cats took direction from her about route selection and rest stops, and they clearly considered her to be responsible for Thomas's safety during the expedition. "They're treating you like you're in charge," Thomas observed during one of their rest stops. "I've never seen wild predators defer to a human the way these cats defer to you." Elena had noticed the same behavior, and it both thrilled and concerned her. The responsibility of leading a community of super predators through dangerous territory was unlike anything she had imagined when she first arrived in Cedar Falls as a rejected mail-order bride. The illegal mining operation they discovered was far more extensive and destructive than either Elena or Thomas had anticipated. A consortium of companies had established a full-scale extraction facility in a remote valley that was supposed to be protected federal wilderness. Heavy machinery worked around the clock to strip valuable minerals from mountainsides that had remained untouched for thousands of years. The environmental damage was catastrophic. Entire hillsides had been carved away, leaving raw scars that would take decades to heal. Chemical processing ponds leaked toxic runoff into streams that fed the pristine watershed, and the constant noise from machinery had driven away most of the wildlife that had traditionally used the valley for feeding and breeding. But most disturbing was the evidence that the mining operation was being conducted with full knowledge and cooperation of federal officials who should have been protecting the wilderness area. Guard stations that should have prevented unauthorized access were unmanned, and warning signs about environmental protection had been removed or defaced. "This isn't just illegal mining," Thomas said as they observed the operation from a concealed position on the valley rim. "This is systematic destruction of one of the most ecologically important areas in the northern Rockies." Elena felt rage building inside her as she watched the machinery tearing apart landscape that the ancient records described as the spiritual heart of the predator kingdom. The mountain lions had been trying to protect this valley for years, but their efforts had been ineffective against the scale of industrial destruction. "We need to document everything," Elena said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised both her and Thomas. "Photos, GPS coordinates, evidence of the permit violations, and proof that this operation is being protected by corrupt officials." Thomas began photographing the mining operation, using telephoto lenses that could capture clear images from their distant observation point. But as he worked, Elena noticed that they were no longer alone on the valley rim. Mountain lions had been positioning themselves at strategic points around the entire mining operation, apparently preparing for some kind of coordinated action. "They're planning something," Elena told Thomas. "The cats are getting ready to intervene directly." "Intervene how?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to understand that normal assumptions about animal behavior didn't apply to the mountain lions they had been observing. Elena closed her eyes and focused on the communications she was receiving from the predator network. The mountain lions had been watching the mining operation for months, learning the schedules and security procedures used by the human workers. They had spotted weaknesses in the facility's defenses and were planning a coordinated attack that would shut down the operation for good. "They're going to destroy the machinery," Elena said, opening her eyes with an expression of certainty that impressed Thomas with its intensity. "Tonight, when most of the workers have left for the day, they're going to systematically disable every piece of equipment in the valley." The prospect of witnessing a predator attack on industrial equipment should have seemed impossible, but Thomas had seen enough unusual behavior from the mountain lions to believe that such coordination was within their capabilities. The cats were clearly operating with intelligence and planning abilities that exceeded normal animal thinking. "Can they actually succeed against that kind of industrial infrastructure?" Thomas asked. "They've been preparing for this for a long time," Elena replied. "And they have advantages that the mining operation doesn't expect. These cats can move through terrain that humans consider impassable. They can coordinate attacks over large distances, and they're motivated by the kind of territorial protection instinct that makes predators extremely dangerous when defending their core territory." As evening approached, Elena and Thomas witnessed one of the most extraordinary wildlife events ever recorded. The mountain lion attack on the illegal mining operation was executed with military precision that demonstrated planning, communication, and tactical thinking that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence. The assault began with systematic destruction of the facility's electrical infrastructure. Mountain lions climbed transmission towers and power poles, using their claws and weight to bring down power lines that left the entire operation in darkness. Other cats simultaneously attacked fuel storage tanks, puncturing them with precisely placed claw strikes that caused massive fuel spills, but avoided explosions that might have created forest fires. The heavy machinery proved more challenging to disable, but the mountain lions adapted their tactics to target weak components. Hydraulic lines were severed, electrical systems were torn apart, and computerized control units were destroyed with focused precision that suggested the cats understood exactly which components were essential for equipment function. The human workers who remained at the facility overnight were not harmed, but they were systematically herded into a single building where they remained trapped, but safe while the mountain lions completed their destruction of the mining equipment. The cats seemed to understand the difference between the workers who were simply doing their jobs and the corporate executives who were responsible for the illegal operation. The entire attack was completed within 3 hours, leaving the mining facility completely inoperative, but without any human casualties. As dawn broke over the valley, Elena and Thomas could see that every piece of major equipment had been disabled. Every fuel tank had been drained, and every electrical system had been destroyed. "I've never seen anything like that," Thomas said, as they watched the mountain lions disappearing back into the forest. The coordination, the precision, the tactical thinking. It was like watching a military operation conducted by animals that understood technology better than they should. Elena felt a deep satisfaction as she surveyed the disabled mining operation. Justice had been served through methods that human law enforcement couldn't have achieved, and the sacred valley would be protected from further industrial destruction. But she also understood that the night's events would have consequences that extended beyond the immediate protection of wilderness areas. The mining consortium would report the attack to federal authorities, and investigations would be launched to determine how domestic wildlife had been able to conduct such sophisticated sabotage. Elena's connection to the mountain lion community would make her a person of interest in any official inquiry, and her unusual abilities would be difficult to explain to skeptical investigators. "We need to return to town and report what we've observed," Thomas said as they packed their equipment. "The state needs to know about the illegal mining operation, and federal authorities will need to investigate the permit violations." Elena agreed, but she was beginning to understand that their expedition had revealed connections between herself and the mountain wilderness that would be impossible to explain to conventional authorities. Her ability to communicate with the predator community and interpret ancient records marked her as something more than a typical human, and that difference would create challenges when they returned to the world of normal society, not as they began their journey back toward Cedar Falls. Elena felt the mountain lions continuing to escort them through the high country. The great cats maintained their protective formation around the human travelers, ensuring safe passage through terrain that would have been dangerous for people traveling alone. But Elena also sensed that the predator community was communicating information about threats that extended beyond the illegal mining operation. The mountain lions had been observing human activities throughout the northern mountains for years, and they had identified other illegal operations that were damaging the wilderness ecosystem. "There are other problems," Elena told Thomas as they navigated a difficult section of trail. "The mining operation we witnessed was just one part of a larger pattern of illegal activities in the protected areas." "What kind of activities?" Elena interpreted the complex information she was receiving from the mountain lion network. "Drug cultivation in remote valleys, illegal logging operations that are clear-cutting old-growth forests, and hunting guides who are taking clients into protected areas to kill endangered species." The scope of illegal activities was far more extensive than anything Thomas had suspected when he first accepted the state contract to investigate unusual predator behavior. The mountain lions had been trying to protect their territory from multiple threats, and their unusual activity patterns were actually the result of defensive actions against human encroachment. "Why haven't these activities been reported to federal authorities?" Thomas asked. "Because the people responsible for protecting the wilderness are the same people who are profiting from its destruction. Elena replied, channeling knowledge that seemed to come from both the ancient records and the mountain lion intelligence network. The revelation connected their mountain expedition to patterns of corruption that Elena recognized from her previous life experiences. Illegal profits protected by corrupt officials, witnesses eliminated when they threatened to expose criminal operations, and environmental destruction justified by false economic arguments. As they descended toward the tree line, Elena realized that their expedition had uncovered more than unusual wildlife behavior. They had discovered evidence of systematic criminal activity that threatened one of the most important wilderness areas in North America, and they had gained access to intelligence sources that could expose the full scope of the illegal operations. But returning to civilization would mean leaving the mountain lion community that had accepted her as one of their own, and Elena wasn't sure she was ready to abandon the first place where her unusual nature had been seen as an asset rather than a liability. The choice between human society and predator community would define the next phase of her journey, and Elena Vasquez was beginning to understand that her rejection as a mail-order bride had been the first step toward discovering her true purpose. As a guardian of the sacred wilderness kingdom that glowed behind her predator gaze. The return journey to Cedar Falls took 4 days of careful navigation through mountain terrain that seemed increasingly hostile to human presence. Elena noticed that the familiar trails they had used during their ascent now felt different, as if the landscape itself was warning them about dangers that awaited in the settled areas below. Thomas attributed the change in atmosphere to their own heightened awareness after witnessing the mountain lion attack on the mining operation. But Elena understood that the predator network was communicating urgent information about threats that had developed while they were in the high country. The mountain lions escorting them maintained unusually tight formation around their small group, with scouts ranging ahead to check potential ambush points and rear guards, ensuring they weren't being followed by hostile forces. The level of military precision in their protective formation suggested that the cats expected serious opposition to their return. "Something's changed down there," Elena told Thomas as they paused to rest on a ridge that provided a clear view of Cedar Falls in the valley below. "The town looks different." Thomas studied the settlement through his binoculars, noting several unusual details that hadn't been present when they first departed for the mountains. Black vehicles were parked outside the boarding house where Elena had initially stayed, and men in business suits were moving through the streets with the purposeful manner of federal investigators. "Looks like our radio reports about the mining operation attracted more attention than we expected," Thomas observed. "Those vehicles suggest that multiple agencies are now involved in whatever investigation is taking place." Elena felt uneasiness building in her chest as she watched the activity in Cedar Falls. Her connection to the mountain lion network was providing information about the true nature of the federal presence, and the news was more ominous than Thomas suspected. "They're not here to investigate the mining operation," Elena said, interpreting communications from the predator scouts who had been observing the town. "They're here to contain information about what we discovered." "What do you mean?" Elena struggled to translate the complex intelligence she was receiving from the mountain lions into terms that Thomas could understand. "The people responsible for protecting the illegal mining operation have resources that go far beyond local corruption. They have connections in federal agencies, and they're using those connections to control the investigation." The revelation chilled Thomas because it suggested that their efforts to report environmental crimes might have placed them in danger from the same corrupt network they were trying to expose. Federal protection could become federal persecution if the wrong people were controlling the investigation. As they continued their descent toward town, Elena received increasingly urgent warnings from the mountain lion network about specific threats awaiting them. The predators had been conducting surveillance of the federal agents in Cedar Falls, and they had identified behavior patterns that suggested hostile rather than protective intentions. We need to avoid the main roads, Elena advised Thomas as they approached the outskirts of town. The cats are telling me that there are checkpoints and surveillance positions that will prevent us from reaching safety. Thomas consulted his topographical maps, looking for alternate routes that would allow them to approach Cedar Falls without using the obvious trails and roads. But Elena was already receiving detailed navigation information from the mountain lions who had mapped every possible approach to the settlement. This way, Elena said, leading Thomas along a deer trail that paralleled the main road but remained concealed within dense forest cover. There's a back way into town that the federal agents don't know about. The alternate route led them through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without the mountain lion guidance that Elena was receiving. Hidden valleys and narrow canyons provided concealment from aerial surveillance, while animal trails offered footing that left minimal traces for human trackers to follow. As they moved through the concealed approaches to Cedar Falls, Elena began receiving disturbing intelligence about the federal agents who had occupied the town. The mountain lions had been observing their activities closely, and the predators had identified behavior that suggested criminal rather than law enforcement motivations. The agents aren't investigating the mining operation, Elena told Thomas as they paused in a concealed position that provided visual access to the town's main street. They're eliminating evidence and removing witnesses who might threaten the illegal activities. How can you be certain of that? Elena pointed toward the boarding house where she had initially stayed after arriving in Cedar Falls. See the woman talking to the agents outside Margaret Flynn's boarding house. That's Linda Morrison, a freelance journalist who was investigating environmental crimes in this area. The cats watched her arrive yesterday, but they also watched the agents take her into custody this morning. Thomas used his binoculars to study the scene Elena was describing. He could see federal agents loading boxes of documents into their vehicles, apparently confiscating materials that might contain evidence of the illegal mining operation. But the agents' behavior suggested they were destroying evidence rather than preserving it for prosecution. Those aren't legitimate federal investigators, Thomas concluded after observing their methods. Real agents would be documenting and protecting evidence, not destroying it. Elena nodded grimly. The mountain lions have been tracking the agents' communications using their enhanced hearing abilities. The conversations they're overhearing suggest that these people are working for the same consortium that was running the illegal mining operation. The intelligence provided by the Predator Network painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond local officials, taking bribes to ignore environmental violations. The mining consortium had connections throughout federal agencies, and they were using those connections to prevent legitimate investigations while eliminating anyone who threatened to expose their operations. Margaret Flynn is missing, Elena added, interpreting additional information from the mountain lions. The agents questioned her about our expedition, and when she couldn't provide the answers they wanted, they took her somewhere outside of town. The news about Margaret's disappearance transformed their situation from inconvenient surveillance to immediate danger. If the corrupt agents were willing to kidnap local citizens to prevent information about the mining operation from reaching legitimate authorities, they would certainly be willing to eliminate Elena and Thomas to protect their criminal enterprise. We can't go back to town, Thomas said, reaching the same conclusion that Elena had already accepted. If these agents are willing to kidnap witnesses, they won't hesitate to kill us to prevent our testimony about what we observed. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she realized that their expedition had uncovered criminal activities that threatened not only the mountain wilderness, but also anyone who tried to expose the truth. The rejection she had experienced as a mail-order bride now seemed insignificant compared to the life and death consequences of her newfound role as a bridge walker between human and predator communities. The cats are offering sanctuary, Elena told Thomas after receiving new communications from the Mountain Lion Network. They can protect us in the high country while we figure out how to get information to legitimate authorities. For how long? As long as necessary, Elena replied, though she was beginning to understand that returning to normal human society might not be possible after everything they had witnessed. The predator community has survived in these mountains for thousands of years despite human encroachment. They know how to remain hidden from people who mean them harm. The decision to retreat back into the mountains marked a fundamental turning point in Elena's transformation from rejected mail-order bride to guardian of the sacred wilderness. She was choosing the predator community over human society, accepting responsibilities that would permanently separate her from conventional life. As they began climbing back toward the high country, Elena noticed that her connection to the mountain lion network was becoming stronger and more complex. She could now distinguish between individual cats based on their mental signatures, and she was receiving information about territory that extended far beyond the areas they had personally explored. The mountain lions were part of a communication network that spanned the entire northern Rocky Mountain region, with intelligence gathering capabilities that rivaled any human surveillance system. Through their enhanced senses and coordinated movement patterns, the predators maintained awareness of human activities across thousands of square miles of wilderness territory. There are other bridge walkers, Elena told Thomas as they climbed toward a secure campsite that the mountain lions had recommended. Not many, but the cats are in contact with a few individuals who have similar abilities to mine. Where are they? Elena sorted through the complex information she was receiving from the predator network. A woman in northern Idaho who can communicate with wolf packs, a man in Montana who works with grizzly bears, and several people in Canada who have connections to various predator species. The existence of other bridge walkers suggested that Elena's abilities were part of a larger pattern of human evolution that was occurring in response to environmental pressures and the need for communication between species. The ancient settlement they had discovered in the canyon was evidence that such abilities had existed historically, but modern bridge walkers were redeveloping these capabilities independently. We're not isolated cases, Elena continued as they reached the secure campsite the mountain lions had selected. There's an entire network of people who are developing enhanced connections to predator communities, and we're all being drawn to wilderness areas where our abilities are most needed. Thomas set up their camp while Elena maintained communication with the mountain lion network, coordinating security arrangements that would protect them from the corrupt federal agents who were searching for them in the lower elevations. Predator's intelligence network was tracking the movements of every hostile human in the region, providing real-time updates that kept Elena and Thomas ahead of their pursuers. The agents have expanded their search, Elena reported as she interpreted the latest communications from the predator scouts. They're using helicopters and ground teams to systematically search every trail and campsite in the area. How long before they reach this elevation? The cats estimate 3 days if the agents continue their current search pattern, Elena replied. But the predators are planning to create diversions that will redirect the search teams away from our actual location. The mountain lion network began implementing a sophisticated deception campaign that demonstrated tactical thinking capabilities that exceeded anything Thomas had previously attributed to animal intelligence. Fake trail signs were created to mislead human trackers. Scent markers were placed to suggest false directions of travel, and deliberate disturbances were made at decoy locations to draw search teams away from Elena and Thomas's actual position. More impressively, individual mountain lions began appearing to surveillance aircraft at strategic locations, creating sightings that would focus official attention on areas far from the secure campsite. The cats seemed to understand that humans would prioritize investigating unusual predator activity over systematic searches for missing persons. They're protecting us the same way they would protect their own cubs, Elena observed as she watched the coordinated deception campaign unfold. The entire community is treating our safety as a priority that justifies significant risks to individual cats. Thomas documented the predator behavior he was witnessing, but he was beginning to understand that conventional wildlife management concepts were inadequate for describing animals that demonstrated such advanced social organization and strategic thinking. The mountain lions were operating as an intelligent species that deserved recognition and protection under laws that currently applied only to human communities. On their second night in the secure camp, Elena experienced the most intense connection to the predator network that she had yet encountered. In her dreams, she found herself running through the mountain forests as part of a hunting pack, experiencing the world through enhanced senses that could detect scent trails invisible to human perception and hear sounds across vast distances. The dream state communication revealed that the mountain lion network extended far beyond the cats she had personally encountered. Predator communities throughout the Rocky Mountain region were in contact with each other, sharing information about environmental threats and coordinating responses that protected wilderness areas from human encroachment. "There's a gathering planned," Elena told Thomas when she woke from the intense dreaming experience. "Representatives from predator communities across several states are coming together to address the escalating threats to their territories." "Where?" "A place the cats call the Heart of Stone," Elena replied, though the geographical reference was unlike anything on their topographical maps. "It's a sacred site where important decisions about territorial protection have been made for thousands of years." Thomas studied their maps carefully, looking for geological features that might correspond to the location Elena was describing. "Could you be more specific about the direction or distance?" Elena closed her eyes and focused on the navigation information she was receiving from the mountain lions. "Northwest, about 60 miles, at an elevation above the tree line where ancient stone formations create natural amphitheaters." The description matched a remote area of the glacier peak wilderness that Thomas had heard about but never visited personally. The region was considered extremely difficult to access, with terrain that challenged even experienced mountaineers and weather conditions that could become life-threatening without proper equipment and planning. "That's serious backcountry," Thomas warned. "The elevation and exposure make it dangerous for humans, even with the best preparation." "The bridge walkers are expected to attend," Elena replied. "This gathering happens rarely, only when threats to the predator territories become serious enough to require coordinated responses across multiple species and regions." Elena felt compelled to attend the gathering, both by her growing connection to the predator network and by her understanding that the corruption they had discovered was part of a larger pattern of environmental destruction that threatened wilderness areas throughout the western United States. The mining operation they had witnessed was just one example of illegal activities that were systematically destroying habitat that predator communities needed for survival. "If we're going to make a difference in exposing the criminal network we discovered, we need allies who understand the full scope of what we're dealing with," Elena told Thomas. "The other bridge walkers might have information and resources that could help us get the truth to legitimate authorities." Thomas agreed to attempt the journey to the Heart of Stone, though he insisted on preparing for the expedition with the kind of equipment and supplies that would be necessary for survival in extreme mountain conditions. The mountain lions could provide guidance and protection, but humans still needed appropriate gear to survive at high elevation in potentially severe weather. The preparation phase revealed how completely Elena's priorities had shifted from human to predator concerns. She was more interested in learning advanced communication techniques from the mountain lion network than in planning for human survival needs during the expedition. "You're changing," Thomas observed as they organized their supplies for the journey to the gathering site. "Your connection to the cats is becoming stronger than your connection to human society." Elena considered his observation carefully before responding. Human society rejected me for being different. The predator community accepts me for the same differences that made me an outcast among people. Which connection do you think is more valuable for someone like me? The question highlighted a fundamental choice that Elena was facing between human and predator identity. Her abilities as a bridge walker were becoming more powerful as her connection to the mountain lion network deepened. But that same connection was making it increasingly difficult for her to relate to human concerns and motivations. You're still human, Thomas reminded her. Whatever abilities you're developing, you still need some connection to your own species. Do I? Elena asked. Or am I becoming something else entirely, something that belongs more to the wilderness than to civilization? The philosophical question would be answered by their experiences at the Heart of Stone gathering, where Elena would encounter other bridge walkers and learn about the full scope of her evolving role as a guardian of the sacred wilderness, kingdom that existed beyond normal human understanding. As they began their journey toward the gathering site, Elena felt the mountain lion network reorganizing itself to provide escort and protection services that would be essential for reaching the remote location safely. The cats were treating the expedition as a matter of critical importance to the future survival of predator communities throughout the region. The corrupt federal agents were still searching for them in the lower elevations, but their pursuit had been successfully misdirected by the predator deception campaign. Elena and Thomas were now protected by an intelligence network that could track human activities across hundreds of square miles while concealing their own movement through terrain that most humans would consider impassable. This is your last chance to return to normal human society, Thomas told Elena as they climbed toward the higher elevations where the gathering would take place. Once you fully commit to your role as a bridge walker, there may not be any way back to the life you knew before. Elena looked back toward the valleys below, where human settlements represented safety and conventional existence. Then she looked ahead toward the mountain peaks where predator communities offered acceptance and purpose that she had never found among her own species. I was never meant for normal human society, she replied. My eyes, my instincts, my ability to communicate with predators, everything about me was designed for this role. Robert Mitchell's rejection wasn't a failure, it was liberation from trying to be something I was never supposed to be. The journey to the Heart of Stone would test Elena's commitment to her new identity, while revealing the true scope of the responsibilities that came with serving as a bridge between human and predator worlds. The gathering would determine whether she was ready to fully embrace her destiny as a guardian of the sacred wilderness kingdom, or whether the human part of her nature would ultimately reclaim control over her evolving consciousness. The mountain lions escorting them began calling to each other across the peaks with complex vocalizations that seemed to announce their approach to other predator communities. Elena understood that their arrival at the gathering site would mark the beginning of a new phase in her transformation, one that would determine not only her personal future, but also the fate of wilderness areas throughout the region that depended on bridge walker protection for their survival. As they climbed toward the Heart of Stone, Elena Vasquez felt the last connections to her former life as a rejected mail-order bride falling away like unnecessary weight. She was becoming something new, something that belonged entirely to the wild kingdom that glowed behind her predator gaze, and she was finally ready to discover what that transformation would mean for both her own destiny and the ancient responsibilities that came with walking between worlds. The Heart of Stone revealed itself as a natural amphitheater, carved from ancient granite formations that rose above the tree line, like the ruins of a forgotten civilization. Elena and Thomas reached the gathering site after 3 days of climbing, through terrain that tested the limits of human endurance, guided by mountain lions whose knowledge of hidden routes made the journey possible. The sight that greeted them challenged every assumption Thomas had developed about wildlife behavior during his years as a professional tracker. Representatives from predator communities across multiple states had assembled in the stone amphitheater, creating a gathering that defied conventional understanding of animal social organization. Mountain lions from various regions occupied the higher ledges of the formation, their distinctive colorations and markings identifying different territorial populations. Wolves from northern Montana and Idaho had claimed positions on the eastern slopes, while grizzly bears from Yellowstone and Glacier dominated the western approaches. Even more exotic predators were present, including lynx from the Canadian wilderness and wolverines from the most remote mountain areas. But the most striking aspect of the gathering was the presence of humans, who moved among the predator communities with the same ease and acceptance that Elena had experienced with her mountain lion escorts. These were the other bridge walkers, individuals whose unusual abilities had earned them recognition as intermediaries between human and animal worlds. Elena counted 8 other humans scattered throughout the amphitheater, each one positioned near specific predator groups that clearly recognized them as allies rather than potential prey. The bridge walkers were diverse in age and background, but they all shared certain physical characteristics that marked them as something different from ordinary humans. One woman who appeared to be in her 40s stood among a pack of wolves, with eyes that reflected light like polished silver. A younger man near the bear delegation had the kind of muscular build and alert posture that suggested enhanced physical capabilities. An elderly Native American woman occupied a position of obvious respect near the center of the gathering, her presence suggesting years of experience in facilitating communication between species. Thomas remained on the periphery of the assembly, while Elena approached the central area where the bridge walkers had gathered. The predators watched her movement with the kind of intense attention that suggested her arrival had been anticipated and was considered significant to the purpose of the gathering. "You're the one who communicated with the guardian cats in the Southern Territory," said the elderly woman, her voice carrying authority that commanded respect from both human and animal participants. "I am Sarah Windwalker, and I have been facilitating these gatherings for over 30 years. Elena felt immediate recognition and respect for Sarah, whose abilities as a bridge walker were clearly far more advanced than her own developing capabilities. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I'm still learning about what I'm supposed to do with these abilities." "You've already done more than most bridge walkers accomplish in their first year," Sarah replied. "The mountain lions report that you successfully interpreted ancient records, coordinated territorial defense activities, and exposed illegal activities that were threatening sacred lands." The commendation carried weight because it came from someone whose experience and expertise were clearly recognized by the entire predator community. Elena felt both pride and humility as she realized that her actions in the northern mountains had been observed and evaluated by bridge walkers throughout the region. Sarah gestured toward the assembled predators, whose numbers Elena now estimated at over 200 individuals representing multiple species. "This gathering was called because the threats to our territories have reached a crisis level. The illegal activities you discovered are part of a systematic campaign to destroy wilderness areas throughout the western states." "Systematic campaign?" "Coordinated criminal enterprises operating under federal protection," Sarah explained. "Mining operations, logging companies, land developers, and energy corporations are working together to exploit resources in protected areas while corrupt officials prevent legitimate law enforcement from interfering." Elena felt the familiar chill of recognition that accompanied discoveries of large-scale corruption. The same people who were running the illegal mining operation. The mining operation was controlled by a corporation called Wilderness Resource Management, Sarah continued. WRM has contracts for resource extraction throughout the Rocky Mountain region, and they use their political connections to operate in areas that should be protected by federal law. The revelation expanded the scope of criminal activity far beyond what Elena had initially suspected. Instead of isolated environmental crimes, she was learning about organized efforts to systematically exploit natural resources that belong to future generations of both human and animal communities. What can we do against that kind of organized criminal activity? Elena asked. Sarah smiled with an expression that combined wisdom and determination. We have resources that criminals don't expect or understand. The Predator Intelligence Network extends across thousands of square miles, and we can coordinate responses that target multiple locations simultaneously. The gathering proceeded with formal presentations from each Predator delegation describing threats to their specific territories and requesting assistance from the broader community. Elena served as translator for the mountain lion reports, interpreting complex vocalizations that described illegal activities across multiple states. The wolves reported systematic poisoning campaigns designed to eliminate their populations from areas where energy companies wanted to conduct hydraulic fracturing operations. The bears described habitat destruction from logging activities that violated federal environmental protections. Even the smaller predator species had documented evidence of illegal activities that threatened their survival. The pattern is consistent across all territories, Sarah observed as she compiled the reports from different delegations. Wilderness Resource Management and its subsidiary companies are conducting illegal operations throughout the region, using the same corrupt federal officials to prevent legitimate oversight. Thomas documented everything he witnessed, though he understood that conventional law enforcement agencies would find it difficult to accept testimony that had been obtained through communication with wildlife. The challenge would be translating predator intelligence into evidence that human legal systems could process and act upon. We need human allies who can present this information through official channels, Elena said as she processed the scope of criminal activity that the predator communities had documented. Even with all our evidence, we need people in legitimate authority positions who will take action. We have been developing such allies, Sarah replied. Agent Jennifer Collins from the FBI Environmental Crimes Unit has been working with Bridge Walker communities for over 2 years. She understands our capabilities and has been preparing legal cases based on intelligence that we provide. The mention of a federal agent who was willing to work with Bridge Walker communities gave Elena hope that their efforts to expose criminal activity might actually achieve results. But she was also aware that corrupt networks often had sources within law enforcement agencies who could compromise investigations. Can we trust her? Elena asked. Agent Collins has proven her reliability through actions rather than promises, Sarah said. She has successfully prosecuted several environmental crime cases using evidence that our community provided, and she has protected Bridge Walker identities even under pressure from corrupt officials. The gathering continued with strategic planning sessions where predator communities coordinated responses to the criminal activities threatening their territories. Elena was amazed by the level of tactical sophistication that the animals demonstrated as they planned coordinated actions across multiple states. The mountain lions would continue their intelligence-gathering operations while expanding their surveillance to cover facilities operated by Wilderness Resource Management subsidiaries. The wolves would conduct reconnaissance of energy company installations to document violations of environmental protection laws. The bears would monitor logging operations and provide evidence of illegal clearcutting in protected forests. Each species contributes capabilities that the others lack, Sarah explained as Elena observed the planning process. Mountain lions provide stealth and climbing abilities for accessing difficult surveillance positions. Wolves offer pack coordination and long-distance communication. Bears contribute strength and endurance for operations that require sustained physical effort. Elena's role in the coordinated response would be to serve as the primary human liaison for operations in the northern Montana region. Her connection to the mountain lion network and her developing abilities as a bridge walker made her the Logical choice for coordinating predator activities with human law enforcement efforts. Agent Collins wants to meet with you personally, Sarah told Elena as the gathering moved toward its conclusion. She's been following reports about the mining operation you exposed, and she believes your testimony could be crucial for building federal cases against wilderness resource management. The prospect of meeting with a federal agent was both exciting and terrifying for Elena. She had spent weeks hiding from corrupt officials who were trying to eliminate witnesses and trusting any representative of federal authority required a level of faith that challenged her survival instincts. How do we know this isn't a trap? Elena asked. The corrupt agents in Cedar Falls were also claiming to be federal investigators. Agent Collins will meet us at a location where the predator community can provide security, Sarah replied. If she brings backup or shows any signs of hostile intent, you'll have protection from animals who can move faster and fight more effectively than any human security force. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at a location called Mystic Lake, a remote alpine tarn surrounded by terrain that would be impossible for hostile forces to approach without detection by predator scouts. Elena would have the entire mountain lion network monitoring the area, along with support from wolf and bear communities that had committed to protecting bridge walkers during their cooperation with law enforcement. As the Heart of Stone gathering dispersed, Elena felt both excitement and apprehension about the challenges ahead. She was no longer an isolated individual trying to survive rejection and financial hardship. She had become part of a community that spanned multiple species and operated with capabilities that exceeded anything available to conventional human organizations. The transformation from rejected mail-order bride to bridge walker was nearly complete, but Elena understood that her most important test was still ahead. The meeting with Agent Collins would determine whether her newfound identity could successfully bridge the gap between predator communities and human legal systems. Thomas accompanied Elena on the journey to Mystic Lake, though he would remain at a distance during her meeting with the federal agent. His role had evolved from wilderness guide to documentary witness, and his photographs and observations would provide corroborating evidence for the extraordinary claims that Elena would be making about predator intelligence and criminal activity. Are you ready for this? Thomas asked as they approached the meeting location. Elena looked around at the mountain peaks that surrounded the alpine lake, feeling the presence of dozens of predators who had positioned themselves to monitor the meeting and protect her from potential threats. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. Agent Jennifer Collins arrived at Mystic Lake precisely on schedule, traveling alone and carrying only basic equipment that suggested peaceful rather than hostile intentions. She was a woman in her early 30s with a kind of professional demeanor that suggested extensive experience with unusual investigations. You must be Elena Vasquez, Agent Collins said as she approached the lakeside location where Elena was waiting. I've been looking forward to this conversation for several weeks. Elena studied the federal agent carefully, using her enhanced perceptions to evaluate body language and vocal patterns that might indicate deception or hidden agendas. What she detected was genuine interest and respect rather than the predatory hostility that had characterized the corrupt agents in Cedar Falls. I understand you have information about illegal activities in protected wilderness areas, Agent Collins continued. I also understand that your information comes from sources that most federal agents wouldn't consider credible. That depends on whether you're willing to accept evidence that comes from wildlife intelligence networks, Elena replied. If you need everything to fit into conventional law enforcement categories, we probably don't have much to discuss. Agent Collins smiled with an expression that suggested she was accustomed to working with unconventional sources and methods. I've learned that environmental crimes often require environmental solutions. If predator communities can provide intelligence about illegal activities, I'm willing to work with whatever capabilities they offer. The conversation that followed revealed that Agent Collins had been investigating wilderness resource management for over 3 years, building cases against criminal networks that operated under federal protection. She had successfully prosecuted several smaller companies, but had been unable to access evidence that would support charges against the larger corporate entities that controlled the illegal operations. The problem is that WRM has sources within multiple federal agencies, Agent Collins explained. Every time we get close to building a case against them, our investigations get compromised by people who warn the criminals about our activities. Elena felt the pieces of the puzzle falling into place as she understood why legitimate law enforcement had been ineffective against the criminal network. You need intelligence sources that the corrupt officials don't know about. Exactly. Agent Collins replied. The predator communities you work with have access to information that no human surveillance system could obtain. If you can provide documentation of illegal activities, I can use that evidence to build cases that bypass the compromised channels within federal agencies. Elena spent the next 2 hours describing everything she and Thomas had observed during their expedition in the northern mountains. The illegal mining operation, the systematic destruction of wilderness habitat, the evidence of corruption among federal officials, and the sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities of the predator communities. Agent Collins documented everything with professional thoroughness, asking detailed questions that demonstrated her understanding of both environmental law and the challenges of prosecuting cases involving government corruption. More importantly, she showed no skepticism about Elena's claims regarding communication with wildlife. I've worked with other bridgewalkers, Agent Collins explained when Elena expressed surprise about her acceptance of unconventional intelligence. Sources. I've learned that people with your abilities can provide information that saves years of investigation time. The meeting concluded with Agent Collins providing Elena with secure communication equipment that would allow her to report illegal activities directly to federal prosecutors who were not connected to the compromised agencies. Elena would continue working with the predator communities to gather intelligence, while Agent Collins would translate that information into legal cases that could shut down the criminal operations. This partnership represents the best chance. We've had to expose the full scope of what wilderness resource management has been doing, Agent Collins said as she prepared to leave Mystic Lake. Your unique capabilities give us access to evidence that the criminals don't know we can obtain. Elena felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she watched Agent Collins depart from the lake. After weeks of feeling like an isolated fugitive, she was now part of a coordinated effort that combined predator intelligence with federal law enforcement resources. The mountain lions emerged from their concealed positions as soon as Agent Collins was out of sight, approaching Elena with the kind of celebratory behavior that suggested the meeting had been a success from their perspective as well. She's trustworthy, Elena told Thomas as he rejoined her beside the alpine lake. The cats confirmed that her intentions are genuine and that she doesn't represent a threat to our activities. The partnership with Agent Collins marked the beginning of a new phase in Elena's evolution as a bridge walker. She was no longer just learning to communicate with predator communities. She was using those communications to serve justice and protect wilderness areas that belong to both human and animal populations. As they began their return journey toward the high country camp that had become Elena's primary residence, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since arriving in Cedar Falls as a rejected mail-order bride. Instead of becoming a conventional ranch wife, she had discovered abilities that connected her to ancient traditions and contemporary responsibilities that few humans could understand or accept. The predator communities had given her purpose and belonging that she had never found in human society. The federal partnership would allow her to use her unique capabilities in service of justice and environmental protection. Elena Vasquez had found her true calling as a guardian of the sacred wilderness kingdom that glowed behind her predator gaze. 6 months after their first meeting at Mystic Lake, Agent Collins contacted Elena with news that would change everything. The coordinated intelligence gathering by predator communities across multiple states had provided enough evidence to support federal indictments against 47 individuals connected to wilderness resource management. "We're ready to move," Agent Collins announced during a secure communication session. "Simultaneous raids are scheduled for tomorrow morning at 17 different locations. The predator networks you coordinate have given us actionable intelligence that no human surveillance operation could have obtained." Elena felt a surge of satisfaction as she realized that her transformation from rejected mail-order bride to bridge walker had achieved something meaningful for both human and animal communities. The criminal network that had been systematically destroying wilderness areas would finally face justice. The federal raids exceeded even Agent Collins' optimistic projections. Wilderness resource management executives were arrested at their corporate headquarters in Denver, while field operations throughout the Rocky Mountain region were shut down simultaneously. The coordination required to execute 17 raids without alerting the criminal network had been made possible by predator intelligence that tracked human movements across thousands of square miles. Elena watched the operation unfold from her permanent residence in the northern mountains, a comfortable cabin that Thomas had helped her construct near the ancient settlement where she had first learned about her bridgewalker heritage. Mountain Lion Network provided real-time updates about each raid, confirming arrests and documenting evidence recovery with accuracy that impressed even experienced federal agents. "They're getting everyone," Elena told Thomas as they monitored communications from Agent Collins. "The mining operations supervisors, the corrupt federal officials, even the corporate executives who thought they were protected by their political connections." The trials that followed became landmark cases in environmental law, with Elena providing expert testimony about predator intelligence capabilities and their applications for wilderness protection. Her unusual abilities were presented to federal courts as a legitimate investigative resource rather than supernatural phenomenon, establishing legal precedent for bridgewalker cooperation with law enforcement agencies. Margaret Flynn was rescued from an illegal detention facility in Utah, becoming a key witness whose testimony about kidnapping and intimidation tactics strengthened the federal prosecution. Her experience validated Elena's decision to avoid returning to Cedar Falls when corrupt agents had occupied the town. The financial impact of the criminal convictions extended far beyond individual prison sentences. Wilderness Resource Management was ordered to pay over $800 million in environmental restoration costs, with additional penalties that would fund wilderness protection programs throughout the western states. But the most significant outcome was the formal recognition of predator intelligence networks as valuable resources for environmental protection. Federal agencies established protocols for working with bridgewalkers, creating career paths for individuals whose abilities had previously been dismissed as fantasy or fraud. Elena received offers to join federal agencies as a specialist consultant, but she declined positions that would require her to leave the mountain communities where her bridgewalker abilities were most effective. Instead, she established an independent organization that facilitated communication between predator networks and human authorities. The Sacred Wilderness Foundation became a model for cooperation between species that had never successfully collaborated. In recorded history, Elena served as executive director while maintaining her residence in the high country where mountain lions continued to seek her guidance for territorial protection issues. Thomas remained as Elena's primary human partner, documenting predator intelligence operations and translating their findings into reports that government agencies could understand and act upon. His photography and written accounts of bridgewalker activities became essential resources for researchers studying human-animal communication. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Robert Mitchell hadn't rejected you as a mail-order bride," Thomas said during one of their evening Conversations beside the fire in Elena's mountain cabin. Elena smiled as she considered the question. I would have spent my life trying to be something I was never meant to be. His rejection was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me, even though he didn't intend it that way. The mountain lions that had first escorted Elena and Thomas through the wilderness now served as permanent guardians of the Sacred Wilderness Foundation headquarters. Their presence deterred potential threats, while their intelligence-gathering capabilities supported ongoing environmental protection efforts. Agent Collins visited Elena's mountain residence regularly, coordinating federal investigations that relied on predator intelligence for evidence gathering. The partnership between bridgewalkers and law enforcement had become so successful that similar programs were being established in other regions where environmental crimes threatened wilderness areas. Your work here has changed how federal agencies approach environmental protection, Agent Collins told Elena during her most recent visit. The Predator Intelligence Network has prevented more environmental crimes in the past year than traditional law enforcement stopped in the previous decade. Elena felt deep satisfaction in knowing that her unique abilities were serving purposes that mattered to both current and future generations. The sacred wilderness kingdom that glowed behind her predator gaze was now protected by laws and agencies that recognized its value to human and animal communities alike. The ancient settlement where Elena had first learned about Bridgewalker traditions became a research center where other individuals with similar abilities came to develop their skills. The circle of bridgewalkers expanded as more people discovered connections to predator communities and learned to serve as intermediaries between species. Sarah Windwalker remained Elena's mentor and advisor, visiting the mountain headquarters regularly to provide guidance about advanced bridgewalker techniques and responsibilities. The elder bridgewalker took pride in Elena's rapid development and her success in establishing lasting partnerships between predator networks and human institutions. You have accomplished more in 2 years than most bridgewalkers achieve in their entire careers, Sarah told Elena during a ceremony marking the 2nd anniversary of the Heart of Stone gathering. The ancient traditions are strong in you, and you have adapted them successfully to modern challenges. Elena's eyes, the distinctive predator gaze that had led to her rejection as a mail-order bride, now commanded respect from humans and animals alike. Federal agents sought her counsel, predator communities trusted her leadership, and environmental organizations celebrated her achievements in wilderness protection. The transformation was complete. Elena Vasquez had evolved from a desperate young woman fleeing poverty and rejection into a guardian of sacred wilderness whose influence extended across multiple states and species. Her predator eyes, once a source of shame and isolation, had become the foundation for a career that protected millions of acres of habitat for future generations. As evening settled over the northern mountains, Elena stood outside her cabin and felt the presence of hundreds of mountain lions, wolves, and bears whose territories were now protected by laws that Bridgewalker intelligence had made possible. The sacred wilderness kingdom glowed not just behind her predator gaze, but in the reality of preserved habitat that would survive long after she was gone. The mail-order bride who had been rejected for her cat eyes had become the mountain lion hunter who discovered that her predator gaze contained the power to save an entire wilderness kingdom. Elena's story proved that sometimes the greatest rejections lead to the most extraordinary destinies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.